We're back. Welcome to another episode. Welcome to episode 2. Welcome to part 2 of every Formula One World Champion's worst race that season. Right here on good old Intern Talks Wheel. So we already know the rules. I've gone through every single season in the history of Formula One, found every single world champion, and I will be exposing them for their worst drive of the season they won their respective championships. We did 1950s in episode 1. It's time for episode 2. And we begin with 1960. Jack Brabham was the world champion, and his worst race of the season was Monaco. Why? Because he got disqualified. And he wasn't disqualified for any technical infringement or any of that stuff, or reckless driving. He was disqualified for getting outside assistance, which is something you don't normally see. Yeah? Outside assistance. Jack Brabham, needed outside assistance to finish the Monaco Grand Prix. The FIA said, nope, that's just not how the rules work. Got rid of him. So, yeah, I'm actually kind of nitpicking here. One thing you need to understand is that these championship winning seasons in the early days, very, very hard to find dull moments in them, man. The champions back in these days were completely on it. So fair enough. So I'm gonna go with 1960 Monaco for him. Okay, here we go. 1961, Phil Hill, France. Phil Hill went from pole position to 9th in the 1961 French Grand Prix. I've read every race report, I've looked at every season review, and there is I'm yet to find a valid reason as to why he sunk so low and stunk this bad. So I have no choice but to assume it was a skill issue. Pole to 9th, that's insane, Pole to 9th. Yeah? So yeah, skill issue. Pole to 9th is insane, especially back in the 60s. You're joking, Phil. And this is unrelated. This is very unrelated. But Phil Hill was literally the Lee Clark of the 60s. Of the 8 Formula One races that took place in 1961, Phil Hill was on pole in 5 of them. And you know how many of those 5 poles he converted to a win? 1. He only converted 1 of those poles into a win. I'm pretty sure Von Trips won from more Phil Hill poles than Phil Hill did. 5 poles and 1 win out of those 5 poles is insane. Insanity. Right? And not only that, but Phil Hill only won the championship by 1 point in the end. And Von Trips was the runner-up. Right? And of all the races that Wolfgang Von Trips finished, he only finished 1 race outside of the top 2. Phil Hill finished 3 races outside of the top 2. So do with that information what you will. Yeah? Phil Hill, France. That's his worst race of the season. 1962, Graham Hill was the world champion, and his worst race of the season was Britain, which was not at Silverstone but at Aintree. Yeah? He qualified 5th. And he finished 4th and was a non-factor all day in front of his home crowd. And to Hill's credit, he really cooked in 1962. He really cooked. It's very hard finding this was literally his worst race, and it was P4. He just didn't show up. Yeah? Didn't show up. It's kind of up there with Mike Hawthorne in 58, where it's just you were great all year, you just had this one off day. This was Hill's one off day, so I'm gonna give him that. 1962 British Grand Prix for Graham Hill. 1963, Jim Clark, and I actually don't know. I don't know what his worst race was. Jim Clark in 1963 is one of the best individual seasons of racing a driver has ever put down. I'm so serious. Every race, I can't find his worst drive of the season because he had no bad drives of the season. There's literally no race that I looked at. I looked at all the results. There's not one race in 1963 where this guy underperformed. He cooked every single race. Every race he didn't win in 1963, he had an excuse for not winning. Every single one of them. Yeah? I even saw a P3 finish. Yeah, and I was like, alright, that has to be the worst race of the season. But no. Turns out that P3 came because his car didn't start off the line. And this Clark dude drove from 2 laps down to get that P3. He's insane. He was so insane. He was so insane in 1963. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna give it to the 1963 British Grand Prix. And the reason I'm gonna give it to that is because 1963 Silverstone was his smallest winning margin of the season. That's the only thing I can critique him on. Jim Clark might actually be the GOAT. Fair enough. 1964, John Surtees was the world champion, and his worst race of the season was Mexico. I am so inclined to doing a standalone video on the 1964 Mexican Grand Prix. For all the hype that Abu Dhabi 2010 gets, Brazil 2012, give me another one. Abu Dhabi 2021, give me another one. 2007 Brazil, 2003 Japan. If you think about all the great title deciders in F1 history, why isn't 1964 Mexico talked about? Why isn't it put up there? So I'm gonna give you the rundown. This one's actually gonna take some explaining to do. I'm gonna make a thread on this one day, and I'm gonna post it. It's gonna be great. So going into the finale, right? Graham Hill is leading the championship. He has, I think, 39 points. Surtees is second, and he's only 5 points behind. And Jim Clark is 9 points behind, so he has like an outside shot at it. So basically, for Surtees to win the championship, he has to finish in the top 2 with Hill not scoring a podium. That's the only way he can win it, right? So if he comes second, Hill has to be 4th or lower. And Surtees did half of the job by out qualifying Hill, but it didn't matter because Surtees got cooked at the start. He dropped down to 5th. His own teammates were ahead of him. So Surtees is just laying around in 5th doing nothing, right? And then his teammate Lorenzo Bandini hits Graham Hill. He hits Graham Hill. I don't, whether by mistake or by, I'm not gonna accuse Bandini of doing it on purpose. So let's just say it was a mistake. He hits Graham Hill and gives him damage, and that damage puts Hill 2 laps down. Puts him laps down. He's out of the contention for the win, right? Graham Hill is out of contention for the win. But it doesn't matter because Surtees is still like in 4th, right? So Surtees is in 4th. Still no championship for him at this point. Then Jim Clark, who was leading the race, has an oil line failure that causes an engine failure. So Jim Clark retires from the lead. And that puts Surtees into P3. Still not enough to win the championship. And Clark retired on the penultimate lap, right? So with 2 laps to go, Clark retires, puts Surtees into P3. On the last lap of the race, Ferrari pulled the strings and used team orders to make Bandini, who took out Hill earlier and is still in second, they used team orders to let Bandini give Surtees his P2. And John Surtees takes Bandini's P2 and wins the world championship. This man on the biggest race of his life was nowhere, getting bodied by both title contenders, Clark and Hill. And through a series of unfortunate events and team orders, he wins the championship. Can you imagine F1 Twitter if something like this were to happen today? I guess Abu Dhabi 21 is close, but that was more race direction. This is like if Perez, it's not even the same, but this is like, oh my god, this is alright. This is like if Massa took out Hamilton in Brazil 07 and Alonso was gonna win the race, and then Massa lets Raikkonen through us. It is the greatest. It might be the greatest title decider in the history of racing. 1964 Mexico. I can't believe it. That thread is coming. Hopefully, it will be out before I drop this video. But certes, when the stage was biggest and the lights were brightest, it took organized crime for this man to win the championship. And I love John Surtees. He's a legend. Only man to win a championship on 2 wheels and 4. Respect that man. But this championship, his championship finale performance was not up to par. I'm so serious. 1965, Jim Clark. I'm gonna have to go with Great Britain. Once again, every single race Clark didn't win, he had a valid excuse for not winning. So I have to use the smallest winning margin rule again. He's actually just that good. So yeah, in order to keep this thread going, rather, I'm gonna have to give it to Britain again. It was the smallest winning margin of the season. Fair enough. 1966, Jack Brabham was your world champion, and his worst race of the season was Belgium. Not anything crazy. He just had a day off. He qualified 4th and he finished 4th, and it was his only pure pace finish off the podium in 1966. Fair play to you, Jack Brabham. 1967, Denny Hulme was the world champion, and his worst race of the season was South Africa. Again, Hulme's 1967 season was very good, but South Africa, again, just one of those day off races. He qualified P2, he finished 4th, and it was his only pure pace finish off of the podium that year. So that's, I'm gonna give Hulme South Africa, especially since he qualified P2. Just didn't have the sauce to keep up. 1968, Graham Hill. Graham Hill won the championship, and his worst race of the season was Zandvoort. Worst race of the season was Netherlands because he crashed out. According to Wikipedia, Graham Hill crashed out of the 1968 Dutch Grand Prix. I said I was gonna do more research on why, but when you look at all of his other finishes, it kinda has to be this. Because, again, I'm telling you, man, the world champions in the 60s were some legit drivers, man. The only people that carry down the 60s for world champions are Surtees and Hill. Surtees and Hill, man. They're carrying down the good 60s name. But Hill was great all of 68. Zandvoort was his only blemish, and it's because he crashed out. Not good in my opinion. And last but not least, 1969, the last champion of the 60s decade was Sir Jackie Stewart. And his worst race of the season was Canada, which was held at Mosport, by the way. Yeah, Canada was his worst race of the season because he crashed out just like Hill. He crashed out of Canada. I looked for footage. I didn't find any. So you just have to take I just had to take the results word. And according to the results, my man had a collision. He crashed out. And it's again a shame because Jackie Stewart in 1969 was a very, very good driver. Would have probably been on the podium in every race if he had bulletproof reliability. Every race except this one because he flat out crashed. So couldn't find any footage of it either because, you know, it's pretty far back. As time goes on, as we get more modern into this series, the footage will come, trust me, but not right now. Couldn't find any footage, so just take my word. Canada, worst race of his season. And that's it. We made it to the end of another decade of every world champion's worst race that season. My name is Intern. I was talking wheel, but now I'm signing out. Goodbye.
Yeah.